The mansion stood like a fortress of glass and stone in the Hamptons, a symbol of success admired from afar and whispered about up close. Behind the trimmed hedges and marble pillars, however, life was not polished or serene. Inside those walls lived a man who had mastered the markets, but lost control of his own home. Richard Hayes, 45 years old, widowed and weary, carried the look of someone who knew how to win every battle except the one that mattered most: raising his sons. The Hayes mansion carried an unsettling reputation, one that never appeared in glossy magazines or society columns, but spread quickly among nannies, maids, and childcare agencies across the state. It was the place no nanny lasted. At first, people thought it was Richard's impossible demands or his cold demeanor that drove caretakers away. But soon the truth circulated in hushed voices. His twins were unlike any children the staff had met before. Ethan and Caleb, 7 years old, identical in face but different in nature, were both on the autism spectrum. Ethan spoke little, avoided eye contact, and was prone to sudden bursts of panic when confronted with noise. Caleb preferred silence, repeating patterns endlessly, stacking blocks, or lining up toy cars with exact precision. To outsiders, they were mysterious, even frightening at times. To Richard, they were a daily reminder of how powerless he felt without his wife, whose patience had once balanced his stern nature. The household staff did what they could, but their duties were never meant to replace the careful, patient attention of a caregiver. For every nanny hired, there was a swift end. Some left in frustration, others in fear, and a few simply broke down in tears, confessing that the job was impossible. The agencies grew reluctant to send replacements. One woman lasted 3 days before quitting, leaving in the middle of the night. Another fled after a week, vowing never to return to the mansion. The legend of the Hayes twins grew, and so did Richard's sense of isolation. Behind closed doors, the once celebrated investor was simply a father watching his boys slip further into worlds he could not reach. He sat at his polished oak desk, staring at financial reports worth billions, but when a crash of sound echoed upstairs, his heart clenched with helplessness. He had no strategy, no formula, no chart that could guide him through the storms his children endured. This was the paradox of the Hayes mansion: power and wealth that could command the markets, yet not heal the wounds within its own walls. Richard kept the exterior immaculate, ensuring guests were dazzled by chandeliers, velvet curtains, and the gleaming staircase. But those who stayed long enough saw the cracks, the hurried footsteps of departing staff, the silence of rooms where laughter should have lived, and the heavy air of loneliness that even the grandest decor could not disguise. Still, Richard clung to routine. Each morning he dressed sharply, met with clients, and conducted business with precision. Each evening he returned to the same home where chaos awaited, where his twins looked at him not with anger, but with a distance that pierced him more than words ever could. In those moments he thought of his late wife, of her soft voice guiding Ethan through his meltdowns and her gentle patience when Caleb became lost in his patterns. Without her, Richard was a man guarding treasures he no longer knew how to use. It was a story few people knew, one hidden behind the tall gates and manicured lawns. Yet it was also the story that would soon take an unexpected turn, because sometimes change arrives not with grandeur but with quiet persistence from places least expected. Before we continue, if stories of resilience, family, and unexpected transformations move you, make sure to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next. Because in this mansion where no nanny lasted, someone was about to arrive who would defy every expectation. Richard Hayes had never believed in fate, only in numbers. For years, he lived by the creed that every risk could be calculated, every outcome managed if only one studied the data carefully enough. That belief had turned him into one of the most respected investors in New York. Yet, as he stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Hamptons home, gazing at acres of manicured lawns rolling into the horizon, he felt no sense of victory. The empire he built meant little when the two people who mattered most to him seemed forever beyond his reach. Every corner of the mansion reflected his success. Polished marble gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, imported art lined the hallways, each piece chosen with the same precision he once applied to his trades. Yet beneath the surface, the estate was hollow. He knew it, and though he tried to hide from the truth, it haunted him in quiet moments. The void had opened years earlier, when his wife Charlotte had fallen ill. Her death had not been sudden, but a slow erosion, each day stealing a little more of her strength until the inevitable end. Richard had watched helplessly as she slipped away, leaving him with not only grief, but responsibility he was ill-prepared to shoulder. Charlotte had been the anchor, the patient presence who understood the boys in ways he could not. Her absence left him adrift, a man attempting to command storms with nothing but spreadsheets and deadlines. He tried to keep life orderly after her passing. Meals were scheduled, tutors were hired, therapists came and went, but none of it filled the silence left at the dinner table, where Charlotte's laughter once softened the boys' anxious fidgets. Richard found himself working longer hours, hiding in conference calls and reports, because the world of finance obeyed rules he understood. The world of Ethan and Caleb did not. The twins each bore their challenges differently. Ethan's frustration often boiled into loud cries or frantic gestures when the smallest detail of his environment felt off. A misplaced toy or a sudden sound could send him spiraling, and Richard, despite his best efforts, never knew how to reach him. Caleb, in contrast, withdrew deeper when unsettled, seeking safety in repetition. Richard would find him stacking toy blocks in perfect towers late into the night, his small hands trembling if anyone interrupted his rhythm. These moments tore at Richard's heart. He wanted to comfort them, but his attempts usually ended in failure, widening the chasm between them. Wealth offered him no refuge from this reality. He poured resources into specialists and experts, hoping someone could provide a solution. Agencies promised trained caregivers, therapists offered strategies, yet the results rarely lasted beyond days. When they left, Richard was again alone with the quiet weight of failure. He knew others envied his fortune, yet he often looked at his life and wondered if it was a curse. Trapped in abundance, starved of the one thing he truly needed, connection with his sons. One evening, after another caregiver had resigned, Richard retreated to his office with a glass of whiskey. The dark wood paneling and soft glow of the fireplace offered comfort, but his chest felt heavy. He stared at a framed photograph of Charlotte, holding the boys as toddlers. Her eyes sparkled with joy, while his gaze, even then, seemed distant. He whispered into the quiet, "I don't know how to do this, Char. They need you, not me." The words caught in his throat, breaking him in ways no financial loss ever could. Despite his wealth, Richard carried an invisible poverty, one made of loneliness and guilt. Each morning he woke with renewed resolve, promising himself he would do better. Each night he returned to bed with the same unspoken truth. Money could not buy the patience, warmth, and love his children required, and until he faced that, his empire would remain nothing more than a gilded cage. Still, somewhere deep within, he clung to the faint hope that something or someone might one day change this course. The sound of hurried footsteps across polished marble had become almost routine in the Hayes mansion. Every few weeks, sometimes even days, another nanny arrived at the front door with fresh confidence, only to leave soon after, defeated and shaken. Richard had grown used to watching their cars disappear down the long driveway, each one carrying away another failed attempt at stability. The agencies still sent replacements, though reluctantly. They arrived with glowing resumes, degrees in child development, and an air of certainty. They smiled politely when Richard explained his son's routines, nodding as if his warnings were exaggerated. Yet within hours the weight of reality fell upon them. The twins were not malicious, but their needs were intense, unpredictable, and exhausting. One nanny, a young woman from Connecticut, lasted only 2 days. During a particularly loud thunderstorm, Ethan had panicked, slamming doors and locking himself in a closet. The nanny, unable to coax him out, burst into tears and called Richard at his office. By the time he arrived home, she had packed her belongings, muttering that she wasn't trained for this level of difficulty. Another, a middle-aged woman with years of experience, promised she could handle anything. For the first week, she remained calm, guiding Caleb through his routines and encouraging Ethan to speak. But one morning, Ethan lashed out, biting her arm when she tried to stop him from banging a toy against the wall. Her composure broke. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes," she said, clutching her handbag with trembling hands. "This isn't safe for me or for them." She left before lunch. The story spread quickly among nannies in New York. The Hayes mansion was whispered about in agency offices and coffee shops where childcare workers gathered. "That place is cursed," one said. "The boys are impossible," said another. Rumors twisted the truth until the mansion itself seemed like a haunted house of failed caregivers. Richard heard these whispers indirectly through the agencies. Each new candidate came with hesitation, already poisoned by stories of meltdowns and chaos. He despised the gossip, but could not deny the pattern. His sons had become infamous, their challenges exaggerated into legends. The agencies began to decline his requests outright. "Mr. Hayes," one director said over the phone, her tone polite but firm, "we've exhausted our resources. Perhaps a more specialized facility would be appropriate." The word stung him. Facility. As if his boys were problems to be managed, not children to be loved. He slammed the phone down, rage and guilt twisting in his chest. He told himself he could do this alone, that he didn't need outsiders. Yet every night he saw his exhaustion reflected in the mirror. Dark circles beneath his eyes, shoulders slumped under the weight of trying and failing again. One evening, after the latest nanny stormed out mid-shift, Richard found Ethan curled under the dining table, rocking back and forth. Caleb stood beside him, stacking silverware with mechanical focus, each fork aligned perfectly. Richard crouched down, speaking softly. "It's okay, boys, Daddy's here." But Ethan turned his face away and Caleb didn't look up. The rejection pierced him deeper than words could. Later that night, pacing his office, Richard poured another glass of whiskey and spoke aloud to the emptiness. "What's wrong with me? Why can't I keep anyone here? Why can't I be enough?" His voice broke, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. The truth was inescapable. Wealth could buy caregivers, but it couldn't make them stay. Each departure chipped away at his hope, leaving him more convinced that he was destined to fail his sons. The mansion, grand and resplendent on the outside, was little more than a revolving door of broken attempts. And though Richard didn't know it yet, the cycle of nannies quitting was about to end. Not with another professional, but with someone entirely unexpected, whose presence would challenge every assumption he had made. Mariah Johnson had never imagined her path would lead her to New York. At 32, she carried herself with quiet dignity, though life had not made things easy. She grew up in Atlanta, the eldest of 4 siblings in a small, bustling household, where her mother worked double shifts at a diner, and her father disappeared before she was old enough to remember his face. From an early age, responsibility was woven into her days, packing lunches for her brothers, helping with homework, keeping the younger ones calm when her mother came home too tired to speak. Mariah never saw it as a burden. To her, family meant holding each other together, even when the world outside seemed unyielding. She learned patience not from books or training courses, but from late nights, sitting on the porch with her youngest brother, rocking him gently until he fell asleep. She learned resourcefulness from stretching groceries to feed 6 mouths. These lessons, though ordinary, had shaped her into someone who could withstand storms others fled from. By the time she reached adulthood, Mariah wanted more stability than the endless cycle of odd jobs in Atlanta could offer. She saved money from cleaning houses and serving tables, finally gathering enough for a one-way bus ticket to New York City. The move was daunting, but she carried hope stitched into every step. In New York, she believed she could build a steady life, maybe even send enough money back home to ease her mother's burdens. Her first months in the city were not glamorous. She rented a small room in Queens, furnished with little more than a bed and a second-hand dresser. She took whatever work came her way, scrubbing kitchens, polishing floors, doing laundry in apartments that smelled of perfumes she could never afford. Still, she greeted each day with determination. To her, dignity was not about what work you did, but how you did it. It was through one of these cleaning agencies that Mariah first heard the name Richard Hayes. The staff at the agency spoke of him with mixed tones, admiration for his wealth, pity for his situation, and unease about the difficulties at his home. "They're desperate for someone steady," the coordinator explained, handing her the file. "It's not nanny work, not really. They just need someone trustworthy to help keep the house running." Mariah nodded, though she caught the hesitation in the woman's voice. She wasn't naive. She knew there had to be a reason no one else wanted the job. Still, she needed the work. And more than that, she had a quiet confidence born from years of endurance. Her first day at the Hayes mansion was overwhelming. The gates rose taller than any building from her neighborhood, the driveway stretching longer than some city blocks. Inside, chandeliers glittered above her head, and every surface shone as if polished for royalty. Yet beneath the elegance, Mariah sensed something unsettled. The air was heavy, not with dust, but with tension, like a home too carefully arranged to hide its unrest. She was introduced to Richard briefly. He was courteous, though distant, his words clipped. "We'll keep your duties simple," he said, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond her shoulder. "Cleaning, laundry, organizing the household. The boys are under supervision." He hesitated at that last phrase, as if unwilling to explain further. Mariah nodded, offering a polite smile. She could read the weight behind his tone, but she didn't pry. In the days that followed, she focused on her tasks with quiet consistency. She scrubbed countertops until they gleamed, folded linens into neat stacks, and restored order where chaos had left its trace. The staff noticed her steadiness. "She's different," one whispered in the kitchen. "Doesn't complain, doesn't flinch." But Mariah paid little attention to gossip. She worked with her head down, humming softly as she moved from room to room, carrying with her the calm rhythm that had steadied her siblings years ago. Though she was hired only as a maid, her presence had already begun to ripple through the household. Richard noticed her reliability, the way she never recoiled from the sounds echoing down the hall when the boys struggled. While others rushed to avoid the storm, Mariah never seemed shaken. She didn't know it yet, but the path of her life was about to cross with Ethan and Caleb's in a way that would change them all. It happened on a grey afternoon when rain tapped impatiently against the kitchen windows. The mansion's staff moved about hurriedly, tension thick in the air. From upstairs, the sound of shouting and crashing echoed through the halls. Ethan was in the middle of a meltdown. Plates rattled on the shelves as his cries pierced the house, and Caleb's sharp, repetitive clapping joined in, like an unsettling rhythm of distress. Most of the staff froze. A maid dropped a tray of glasses, muttering nervously, "Not again." The cook glanced at the door, already calculating an excuse to leave early. Even those accustomed to the chaos shrank back, unwilling to get involved. Mariah, who had been wiping down the counters, paused. She didn't rush forward immediately, but she didn't retreat either. She set her cloth aside, her heart tightening as she recognized the sound, not strange to her, but familiar in its intensity. She had heard similar cries from her youngest brother during moments when the world overwhelmed him. Without hesitation, she moved toward the hallway. At the top of the stairs, Ethan's cries grew louder. He threw himself against the wall, hands pressed hard against his ears, while Caleb stood beside him, flapping his arms, distressed by the noise yet trapped in the cycle of it. The other maids whispered urgently, "Stay back, Mariah, it's no use, they won't listen to anyone." Mariah ignored them. She lowered herself to the floor a few feet away, not intruding, but making her presence known in a way that wasn't threatening. Her voice came soft, almost a murmur, as she began to hum an old melody her grandmother used to sing on restless nights in Atlanta. The tune was gentle, steady, like a lullaby stitched with patience. Ethan's cries didn't stop at once, but his rhythm faltered. He turned his face toward the sound, his chest heaving with uneven breaths. Caleb stilled, his clapping slowing, curiosity flickering across his features. Mariah continued, her eyes calm, her body relaxed. She didn't reach for them, didn't try to force comfort, but let the song fill the tense space. Minutes passed before Ethan's sobs softened into hiccups. He slid down the wall, curling into himself, but his hands dropped from his ears. Caleb crouched beside him, both boys unusually still. The mansion, which moments earlier had reverberated with chaos, now held a fragile silence. From the far end of the hallway, Richard had appeared, drawn by the noise, or rather the sudden absence of it. He stood there in disbelief, watching the sight unfold. His twins, usually inconsolable during such storms, were sitting quietly, their eyes flickering toward the maid, whose humming seemed to weave a spell of calm around them. Richard's voice was low, hesitant. What did you do?" Mariah looked up, her tone respectful but steady. "Nothing special, sir, just a song my grandma used to sing." Sometimes rhythm helps." He frowned slightly, unsure whether to accept this explanation. For years, professionals had come and gone, armed with methods, charts, and promises, only to fail. Yet here stood a maid, humming in the hallway, succeeding where so many others had collapsed. It unsettled him almost as much as it relieved him. One of the staff whispered under her breath, "That's impossible." But the evidence lay before their eyes. Ethan was no longer screaming, and Caleb was leaning against his brother quietly. Richard approached slowly, kneeling down beside his sons. He reached out a tentative hand, brushing Caleb's hair from his forehead. For the first time in weeks, neither boy recoiled. They didn't embrace him, but they tolerated his closeness, their small shoulders no longer rigid with panic. When Richard lifted his gaze back to Mariah, his expression was unreadable, a mixture of suspicion, awe, and a reluctant hope he hadn't felt in years. He cleared his throat as if regaining control. "Thank you." I don't know how you managed that." Mariah simply nodded, standing with quiet humility. "Sometimes," she said softly, "you don't need to manage. You just need to listen." Richard studied her for a long moment, the weight of her words lingering in the charged silence. Something had shifted in that hallway, though neither of them could fully name it yet. What was certain, however, was that the rhythm of the Hayes mansion had just changed. The following days carried a subtle shift in the mansion's atmosphere. Where once staff tread lightly, anticipating the next outburst, there was now a cautious sense of curiosity. Mariah had not been hired to care for the boys, yet she found herself drawn into their orbit. It wasn't through deliberate effort, but through quiet gestures that built trust piece by piece. One morning, as the staff prepared breakfast, Ethan wandered into the kitchen, his steps uneven, his eyes darting toward the clattering pans. Normally, he would recoil, overwhelmed by the noise, but Mariah noticed his gaze lingering on the rhythm of her hands as she kneaded dough. Without saying a word, she slowed her movements, softening the sound humming under her breath. Ethan stood in the doorway longer than usual, his shoulders loosening, as if the melody formed a bridge across the space between them. Later that afternoon, Caleb sat cross-legged in the living room, lining toy cars in perfect rows. Most adults disturbed his patterns without realizing how important they were, but Mariah crouched beside him quietly, observing. When he placed a red car next to a blue one, she whispered, "That looks good. Red and blue, strong colors." Caleb glanced at her briefly, a flicker of acknowledgement before returning to his task. It was small, but for Caleb, it was a gesture of trust. Richard noticed these moments from the edges of the room. At first, he resisted the idea that Mariah's presence made a difference. He told himself it was coincidence, that the boys were simply having quieter days. Yet time and again he saw how they responded to her calmness. When Ethan became agitated, she never raised her voice. When Caleb grew lost in his patterns, she respected the rhythm instead of breaking it. Where others saw defiance or chaos, Mariah saw signals, unspoken language she instinctively understood. One evening, Richard found her sitting on the floor with Ethan, tapping softly against a wooden box in a steady rhythm. Ethan mirrored her taps hesitantly, then with more certainty, until the two shared a quiet cadence like a secret conversation. Richard stood silently in the doorway, struck by the sight. His son, who rarely engaged, was not only participating but smiling faintly. Unable to contain his curiosity, Richard finally asked, "How do you do it?" "They never respond like that with anyone else." Mariah looked up, her expression gentle. "I don't think about doing anything special, sir. I just try to meet them where they are. Sometimes all a child needs is someone who doesn't expect them to change in order to be heard. Richard absorbed her words, though they unsettled him. He had spent years hiring experts, demanding progress, measuring outcomes. To him, success was defined by results, by evidence. Yet this maid, without credentials, without training, was achieving what none of the professionals had. The staff whispered about it constantly. In the servants' quarters, they speculated whether her patience was luck or some kind of gift. Some admired her, others resented her, but none could deny the change. The mansion, once a place of constant eruptions, now carried stretches of calm. For Mariah, it wasn't about proving anything. She remembered the nights back in Atlanta, when her youngest brother's cries pierced the air, and how the only thing that soothed him was knowing someone was there, steady and unshaken. To her, Ethan and Caleb weren't impossible. They were children, each carrying a world too heavy to bear alone. As days blended into weeks, the boys' responses grew more consistent. Ethan allowed her to sit beside him during meals, occasionally whispering words so faint she leaned close to catch them. Caleb began handing her cards from his collection, letting her place them in the row, a silent invitation into his ordered world. These were not dramatic breakthroughs, but to Richard they were nothing short of miraculous. Late one night, as he passed by the twins' room, Richard saw them asleep, their breathing even, their faces calm. For the first time in years, the house felt less like a battlefield and more like a home. He stood in the hallway, listening to the quiet, and realized something undeniable. Mariah was doing what no one else had managed. Whispers began to circle the mansion like drafts sneaking through old windows. At first they were quiet, passing comments in the pantry, exchanged glances in the laundry room, but soon they carried sharper edges. "She's just the maid," one of the cooks murmured. "What business does she have spending so much time with the children?" Another answered with a shrug, though his tone carried envy. "Mr. Hayes actually listens to her." That's never happened before. Mariah felt the shift. The same staff who had once ignored her now seemed to watch her every move. Their smiles were polite, but their eyes carried judgment. She knew what they were thinking. It wasn't her place. Her role was to polish silverware and scrub floors, not sit cross-legged on the carpet with Ethan or gently guide Caleb through his routines. Still, she couldn't pretend not to notice the boys reaching for her hand, couldn't walk away when they sought her presence. One afternoon, as she folded linens, the housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Whitmore, approached her. "Mariah," she said coolly, "I hope you remember your position here. The master hired you for housekeeping, not childcare." It's not wise to blur those lines. Mariah looked up calmly, folding another sheet before responding. "I haven't forgotten, Mom, but when the boys come to me, I can't just turn them away. Would you?" Mrs. Whitmore's lips pressed thin. "Sympathy is one thing, attachment is another. Don't confuse the two." She walked away briskly, leaving Mariah with the unmistakable message, "Stay in your place." The resistance wasn't only among the staff. When Richard's business associates visited, they raised eyebrows at the sight of the maid guiding the twins through their routines. One evening, after a meeting in the study, a colleague pulled Richard aside. "You've got the resources to hire the best specialists in the country. Why on earth is your maid spending more time with the children than the professionals?" Richard bristled but found himself without a clear answer. On the one hand, he knew the truth. None of the specialists had made progress like Mariah. On the other, admitting it aloud felt dangerous, as though he were revealing a weakness. He changed the subject, but the comment lingered like a stone in his chest. That night he confronted Mariah in the hallway outside the boys' room. His voice was measured, though tension flickered underneath. "You know the staff is talking. My associates too. They don't understand why you're involved." Mariah straightened, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Do you?" Richard hesitated, his hand tightening on the edge of the doorframe. "I don't know. I've hired experts, paid fortunes, and none of them reached Ethan or Caleb the way you have. But this," he gestured vaguely toward the children's room, "this isn't supposed to be your responsibility." Her reply was simple, but her tone carried quiet conviction. "Maybe responsibility doesn't always follow titles. Sometimes it follows love." The words caught him off guard. For years, his world had been measured in contracts, job descriptions, and boundaries. Love was a currency he hadn't dared to trade in since Charlotte's death. He looked at Mariah, then truly looked, and saw not just a maid but a woman who carried a strength he couldn't quantify. The resistance from others didn't break Mariah's resolve, but it pressed on her. She felt the sting of subtle racism at times, the way certain guests glanced at her with condescension, their tone sharper when addressing her. "You must be grateful to work in such a fine home," one woman said during a dinner party, her smile brittle. Mariah only nodded, swallowing the burn in her chest, because she had learned long ago that dignity wasn't granted by others, it was carried from within. Though doubts and criticism swirled, Mariah remained steady. And while Richard wrestled with conflicting emotions, he couldn't deny one truth. The mansion was no longer drowning in chaos. His sons, for the first time in years, were beginning to show glimmers of peace, and the woman the world dismissed as just the maid was at the center of it. The first breakthrough came quietly, almost by accident. Mariah had been sitting on the rug with Ethan, stacking blocks into a crooked tower, when he whispered something under his breath. She leaned closer, unsure if she had heard correctly. His voice came again, fragile but distinct. "Red block." Her breath caught. Ethan rarely used words, and when he did, they were often echoes of what others had said. But this was spontaneous. She smiled softly. "Yes, Ethan. Red block." She handed him another piece, careful not to make her joy overwhelming. He took it, placing it gently on the tower. For a brief moment, his eyes met hers before darting away again. It was only a second, but to Mariah it felt monumental. Later that evening, Richard found her in the hallway, her eyes still shining with quiet triumph. "He spoke," she told him, her voice low as though saying it too loudly would break the spell. "He said red block." Richard blinked, disbelief flickering across his face. "Tion spoke to you?" "He did," Mariah answered, "not a repetition, his own words." Richard didn't respond immediately. He thought of the countless sessions with therapists, the charts full of expectations unmet, the silence that always weighed on him. For years, he had longed to hear his son's voice without prompting, and now it had happened not in some clinic but in the quiet of his own home with the maid he had never expected to matter this much. The next breakthrough belonged to Caleb. His world was built of patterns and repetition, a fortress of predictability that protected him from chaos. Mariah understood this instinctively. Instead of breaking his routines, she entered them. She sat beside him as he lined up cars, commenting softly on colors or shapes, never moving too fast, never interrupting. One afternoon, after weeks of shared silence, Caleb placed a blue car in her hand. Mariah looked at it, then at him. "Blue car," she said gently. Caleb's eyes flicked up to hers, holding the connection for longer than usual. Slowly he nodded, as if acknowledging her place in his world. Richard witnessed it from the doorway, his chest tightening. "He gave that to you?" he asked later, astonished. "Yes," Mariah replied with a small smile. "It's trust, Mr. Hayes. That's what he's giving." Trust. The word echoed in Richard's mind. Code. For so long he had believed his children incapable of connecting, that their worlds were sealed away from him. But here was proof, fragile and undeniable. And Mariah was the bridge. The days began to carry a new rhythm. Ethan's meltdowns still came, but they were shorter, less explosive when Mariah was near. Caleb's routines remained, yet he began allowing small variations when she suggested them. Richard, once distant during these moments, found himself drawn in. He started sitting quietly nearby, observing, sometimes even joining when Mariah encouraged him with a nod. One evening, Ethan placed a block in Richard's hand. It was a small gesture, but Richard felt as though the earth had shifted beneath him. He swallowed hard, blinking back the sting in his eyes. Mariah, sitting across from them, gave him a look that was both encouraging and steady. In the quiet of those nights, Richard began to see what had been missing all along. Progress wasn't about forcing change or demanding results. It was about presence, patience and love, things Charlotte had always known and things Maria embodied without trying. Though the staff still whispered, Richard no longer cared. He had seen the impossible, his sons opening doors, however slowly, to connection. And at the center of it all was the woman no one had believed in, the woman who listened when others tried to manage. Richard Hayes had always believed that success was measured in control, the ability to bend circumstances to his will. But as he sat in the playroom one evening, watching his sons interact with Maria, he realized how little control he truly had over what mattered most. Ethan tapped out rhythms with a wooden spoon, following Maria's gentle beat, while Caleb allowed her to mix one of his toy cars into his carefully lined pattern. These were small acts, but to Richard, they felt like miracles. He shifted uncomfortably on the floor, his tailored suit never meant for carpet. "I don't know how you do it," he muttered, his voice low but edged with awe. Maria glanced at him, her tone calm as always. "It's not about doing. It's about being here. Steady, even when it's messy." Richard leaned back against the wall, letting the words sink in. Messy. That was something he had avoided his entire life. His career was built on clean calculations and sharp decisions, but sitting here with his sons, he saw that parenting wasn't a problem to solve, it was a presence to offer. Over the following weeks, Richard began to change, though he hardly noticed at first. He started joining Maria and the boys during their quiet moments. At first he hovered at the edges, uncertain, but gradually he dared to participate. One afternoon, when Ethan pushed a block toward him, Richard stacked it without hesitation. Ethan let out a small sound, almost a laugh, and Richard felt a warmth spread through him that no business victory had ever provided. That night he lingered in the kitchen while Maria prepared tea. "I don't think I've ever heard him laugh like that," Richard admitted, his voice thick. Maria gave a small smile. "He laughed because he felt safe with you, not with me. That's what he needs most, Mr. Hayes. To know you're here, not just watching, but with him." The truth stung, but Richard didn't turn away. He had spent years believing his children's distance meant he had failed them. But Maria's words suggested something else, that it wasn't too late. His late wife often came to mind during these moments. He remembered Charlotte's way of slowing down, of refusing to rush the boys when they struggled. She had told him once, "Patience isn't waiting for them to change, it's walking with them where they are." He hadn't understood it then. Now, watching Maria, he began to. Gradually, Richard allowed his rigid schedule to soften. He came home earlier, sometimes skipping late meetings to eat dinner with the twins. The meals were still messy. Ethan fidgeted, Caleb lined his utensils, but Richard no longer saw these as failures. He saw them as life. He even attempted to cook one evening, a comical disaster that left the kitchen smoky and the staff horrified, but the boys giggled at his clumsy attempts. That laughter echoed in Richard's chest long after the dishes were cleared. Still, doubt lingered. One night, as the house quieted, Richard found himself pacing in his office. He poured a glass of whiskey, then set it down, untouched. He whispered into the silence, "Am I enough for them, or am I just pretending?" The next morning he asked Maria quietly, "Do you think they can really get better? That I can be what they need?" Maria looked at him steadily, her eyes warm but firm. "Better isn't the right word, Mr. Hayes. They don't need fixing, they need you, present, patient, willing to love them as they are." That's all. For the first time in years, Richard let the words settle without argument. He didn't have to fix everything. He had to show up, and with Maria's presence as a guide, he began to believe he could. The first test of Richard's newfound resolve came during a family dinner. The Hayes relatives, polished and opinionated, had gathered in the mansion's dining hall for the first time in months. The table glittered with crystal glasses and fine china, but beneath the surface of polite conversation, judgment hovered like an unwelcome guest. Richard's sister Eleanor was the first to speak what others only hinted at. Her voice, elegant yet sharp, cut through the chatter. "Richard, I couldn't help but notice that the maid seems unusually involved with the boys. Is that intentional?" The room quieted. Richard's jaw tightened as he set down his fork. "Her name is Maria," he replied evenly. "And yes, she's been spending time with Ethan and Caleb." Eleanor's brows arched, her smile condescending. "But surely a woman in her position isn't suited to such responsibility. These children need professionals, not household staff." "Appearances matter, Richard. People talk." A cousin chimed in, voice dripping with agreement. "She's overstepping. If word gets out that you're relying on a maid for childcare, it won't reflect well on you or on the family name." Mariah, standing quietly near the doorway with a tray, kept her gaze lowered, but her hands tightened around the silver handles. She had endured such tones before, the kind that reduced her to a role, never a person, yet she refused to let the sting of their words unravel her calm. Richard's patience thinned. He looked around the table, his voice steady but firm. "Appearances don't raise children. Love and stability do. And in case you haven't noticed, for the first time in years, my sons are calmer. They're speaking. They're smiling." Eleanor's expression soured, though she kept her tone smooth. "You can afford the best care money can buy. Why settle for less?" Richard's reply was sharp. "Because money hasn't worked. Specialists, therapists, nannies, they all left. Mariah hasn't. She's given my sons something none of them did. Consistency." The words landed heavily, silencing the room. Some relatives shifted uncomfortably, others whispered behind their napkins. Mariah quietly excused herself, retreating to the kitchen, though her heart pounded. She knew her presence had become a point of conflict, yet Richard's defense of her lit a spark she hadn't expected. Respect, not pity. Later that night, when the guests had gone, Richard found Mariah in the kitchen washing glasses. She didn't look up as she spoke. "I don't want to be the reason your family questions you." He stepped closer, his tone softer than it had been all evening. "You're not the problem, Mariah. They just don't understand. They've never had to live what we live every day." Mariah sighed, drying her hands on a cloth. "Still, I don't want to cause trouble." Richard's gaze held hers. "You're not causing trouble. You're making a difference, and I won't let anyone diminish that, not even my own family." For Richard, the dinner had revealed more than his relatives' prejudice. It forced him to confront the tension between appearances and reality, between the world of wealth he inhabited and the fragile, messy truth of raising his sons. He had spent years hiding behind reputation, guarding the image of the untouchable millionaire. But now, with Mariah's steady influence, he realized that reputation meant nothing if it came at the cost of his children's well-being. That night, as he checked on Ethan and Caleb, who slept peacefully in their beds, Richard made a quiet vow. The world could whisper, judge, even ridicule if it wished. He would no longer measure his worth by society's standards. His son's progress was proof enough, and the woman others dismissed as just the maid had shown him what truly mattered. It was a resolve that would be tested again, but for now, the conviction settled in his heart. Appearances no longer ruled the Hayes mansion. Spring arrived in New York with a soft warmth that coaxed blossoms from trees and lifted the heavy grey skies of winter. The Hayes mansion, once cloaked in tension, now echoed with new rhythms. Ethan hummed more often. Caleb shared his toys in small gestures of trust, and Richard began to feel that change was not only possible, but already unfolding. Still, one challenge remained: the world outside. Until now, the twins' lives had been confined to the mansion, a controlled space where their patterns and routines could be managed. Public outings had always ended in disaster: shouts, meltdowns, panicked retreats. Richard had grown wary of trying, preferring the safety of isolation over the risk of humiliation, but Mariah believed the boys deserved more than walls and routines. They deserved experiences, joy, and discovery. One evening, while tidying up after dinner, she spoke gently. "Mr. Hayes, there's a museum in the city. They host sensory-friendly days for kids like Ethan and Caleb. Lights are dimmed, sounds are softer, staff are trained to help. I think it could be good for them." Richard looked skeptical, his fork pausing mid-air. "We've tried outings before. They don't go well." Mariah met his eyes steadily. "They didn't go well because no one gave them space to be themselves. This is different, and they won't be alone. I'll be there." You'll be there." Her confidence disarmed him. He hesitated, but the image of his sons confined to the mansion weighed heavier than his fear. "All right," he said finally. "We'll try." The day of the trip, the city buzzed with life. Traffic roared, horns blared, and people rushed in every direction. Richard's chest tightened as the car approached the museum, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. But Mariah sat between the twins in the back seat, her calm presence grounding them. Ethan tapped softly against her arm, a rhythm he used when nervous, and she hummed back the familiar tune that soothed him. Caleb clutched one of his cars tightly, his focus locked on its small wheels. Inside the museum, the atmosphere was different from what Richard expected. The lights were dimmer, voices softer, and volunteers greeted families with patience. Other children, each with their own challenges, wandered freely. For once, the Hayes twins weren't unusual. They were simply part of a community. Ethan clung to Richard's hand at first, his grip tight, but gradually loosened when he noticed the gentle lighting. Caleb, usually rigid in new places, stopped to study an exhibit of glowing shapes. He reached out cautiously, his eyes widening as colors shifted under his touch. Mariah knelt beside him. "Look at that, Caleb. Blue, then green. Isn't it beautiful?" To Richard's astonishment, Caleb nodded and whispered, "Green." It was the first word he had spoken in public. Richard's throat tightened, pride and relief flooding him. Further inside, Ethan discovered a display of drums and percussion instruments. Noise usually frightened him, but here the sounds were muted and controlled. He struck a drum lightly, then harder, his eyes widening at the vibration. Mariah encouraged him with a smile. "Go ahead, Ethan, feel it." Soon Richard joined him, tapping a rhythm. Ethan laughed, a clear, bright sound that echoed through the hall. It wasn't the laughter of a boy overwhelmed, but of a child discovering joy. For Richard, it was a sound worth more than all his fortunes combined. By the time they left the museum, the boys were tired but calm. In the car, Ethan leaned against Richard's shoulder, a gesture so rare that Richard hardly dared breathe for fear of disturbing it. Caleb dozed off with the toy car still in his hand, his face peaceful. Richard glanced at Mariah, his voice hushed. "I never thought this was possible." She smiled softly. "It was always possible. They just needed the chance." That day marked more than an outing. It marked the moment Richard realized his son's worlds were larger than he had ever allowed himself to believe. The storm rolled in suddenly, dark clouds swallowing the late afternoon sky. Rain pelted against the windows in sheets, and thunder cracked so loud it rattled the glass. For most, it was a passing inconvenience. For Caleb, it was unbearable. It began with a whimper, then escalated into sharp cries that echoed through the mansion. His small hands covered his ears, his body rocking as though trying to escape the noise that seemed to press in from every direction. Ethan, overwhelmed by his brother's distress and the storm itself, retreated into a corner, humming frantically to drown out the thunder. The staff panicked. A maid rushed forward, unsure how to help, while another suggested calling the doctor. Richard, caught between frustration and helplessness, stood frozen at the edge of the room. "He won't stop," he muttered, his voice cracking. "Nothing ever works when it's like this." Mariah, however, didn't flinch. She moved toward Caleb with steady steps, lowering herself to the floor beside him. She didn't try to pull his hands away from his ears or force him still. Instead, she began to rock gently with him, matching his rhythm. Her voice, soft and low, carried the same hymn she had hummed weeks before, a melody threaded with patience. At first, Caleb's cries grew louder, as though resisting her presence, but she didn't waver. She stayed close, whispering between notes. "You're safe, baby. It's just the rain. You're safe." Minutes passed, each one heavy with tension. Richard paced, torn between stepping in and trusting her. Finally, Caleb's rocking slowed. His cries softened into hiccups, his hands lowering just enough for Mariah's voice to reach him. She placed a hand lightly on his back, her touch steady. "Breathe with me," she whispered. She inhaled deeply, exhaled slowly, repeating until his breaths began to mirror hers. When the thunder cracked again, Caleb flinched but didn't spiral. Instead, he leaned into her, burying his face against her shoulder. Mariah wrapped her arms around him, holding him close through the storm, her body becoming the anchor he had always needed. Across the room, Ethan had stopped humming. He watched the scene intently, his wide eyes fixed on Mariah as though weighing her strength. Slowly he inched toward her, his small hand brushing her arm. She glanced at him, offering a gentle smile. "It's okay, Ethan. You can sit too." To Richard's astonishment, Ethan lowered himself beside them, pressing his shoulder against her. Both boys, usually unreachable during storms, now clung to the same presence, the maid who refused to give up. The room grew quiet except for the rain. Richard stood frozen, his throat tight. For years these meltdowns had been unmanageable, ending with Nanny's leaving in tears and him drowning in guilt. Yet Mariah had stayed, patient through the chaos, unshaken by the storm inside or outside the walls. When Caleb's breathing finally steadied and his body relaxed against her, Mariah looked up at Richard. Her eyes were calm but resolute. "See? They just needed someone to ride the storm with them." Richard swallowed hard, emotion burning in his chest. He had no words, only the realization that this woman, whom society dismissed, had done the impossible once again. Later, when the storm passed and the boys were asleep, Richard found Mariah in the kitchen sipping tea. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. "I thought we'd lose another tonight, that you'd be gone by morning like all the rest." Mariah met his gaze steadily. "I told you, Mr. Hayes. I don't run when it gets hard. That's when you stay." Richard lowered himself into a chair, exhaustion and gratitude mingling in his expression. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that his sons could truly be safe, and that he wasn't alone in giving them that safety. The morning after the storm, the mansion carried a rare stillness. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, glinting off polished marble, but what struck Richard most was the calm in his sons. Ethan sat at the table quietly eating cereal, Caleb humming softly as he rolled a toy car along the wood grain. No lingering chaos, no shadows of the night before, just peace. Richard found Mariah in the garden, tending to the roses. She looked up as he approached, brushing soil from her hands. He cleared his throat, words not coming easily. "Mariah, last night you held them together in a way I never could. I don't think I've ever seen them recover like that." She smiled faintly, her voice gentle. "You could have, you just didn't know how yet. They don't need perfection, Mr. Hayes. They need presence. You gave that when you stayed in the room." Her humility disarmed him. Most people who succeeded where others failed would boast, or at least accept credit. But Mariah turned it back to him, reminding him he was still the father. It stirred something in him, respect, not just gratitude. That evening, Richard gathered his courage. After dinner, he asked Mariah to meet him in his study. The room smelled faintly of old books and leather, the fire casting a warm glow. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please, sit." Mariah hesitated, unused to being invited into the inner sanctum of the mansion, but she obeyed. Richard leaned forward, his tone formal but sincere. "I want to make this clear. You're more than a maid here. You've given my sons stability, hope, something I thought was impossible. I'd like you to stay not just as staff, but in a permanent role as their caregiver." Mariah blinked, surprised. "A caregiver?" "Yes," he said firmly. "Not temporary, not a fill-in until someone else comes along. You've done what experts couldn't. And if you'll accept, I want you here as part of their lives, for good." For a moment the room was silent except for the crackle of the fire. Mariah folded her hands, her voice measured. "Mr. Hayes, I need you to understand something. If I say yes, it's not just a job. I can't care for them halfway. It means I'll love them as if they're mine, through the good days and the storms. That's not a title, it's a commitment." Richard met her gaze, his throat tightening. "That's exactly what they need. And if you're willing, it's what I need too." Her acceptance wasn't immediate, but after a long pause, she nodded. "Then I'll stay." The decision shifted the dynamic of the household. Staff who once whispered began to treat her with reluctant respect. They couldn't deny her importance anymore. Even Mr. Hayes had spoken it aloud. And the boys, sensing the permanence of her presence, blossomed further. Ethan began seeking her out for comfort, tugging her sleeve when he needed grounding. Caleb started allowing her to vary his routines, small changes that signaled profound trust. Richard, too, found himself changing in her presence. He no longer watched from a distance but joined fully. When Ethan stacked blocks, Richard sat beside him. When Caleb lined his cars, Richard asked if he could add one. Often he stumbled, unsure, but Mariah's gentle nods guided him. Together they created an atmosphere of patience and care, a partnership rooted not in hierarchy, but in shared devotion. Late one evening, after the boys had fallen asleep, Richard walked Mariah to the door of the West Wing. He paused, his voice low. "I never thought I'd say this, but I trust you with the most precious part of my life. That means more than I can express." Mariah looked at him steadily, her expression soft but strong. "And I trust you to keep showing up for them." That's all they've ever needed. In that moment, Richard realized his respect for Mariah had grown into something deeper, something that stirred quietly beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. The mansion had grown quieter, not with the silence of distance, but with the calm of stability. For the first time in years, Richard felt he was not living inside a storm, but walking through days that carried rhythm, even warmth. Yet beneath the progress, a heavier truth stirred inside him, one he had long buried, but could no longer avoid. It came late one evening, after the boys had finally drifted to sleep. Richard sat in the study with Mariah, the fire casting flickering light across the shelves of books and framed photographs. He stared at one picture in particular, Charlotte holding the twins as infants, her smile bright despite the exhaustion in her eyes. His throat tightened. "Mariah," he began slowly, his voice uneven, "I need to tell you something I've never admitted aloud." The night Charlotte passed, her last words to me were simple. She said, "Promise me you won't let them feel alone." His jaw clenched as he fought back emotion. And I broke that promise. For years I hid in my work because it was easier than facing their needs. I thought money could cover what I lacked. But all I gave them was absence. Mariah listened without interruption, her hands folded in her lap. When he finally looked up, she met his gaze with quiet strength. "You didn't break the promise," she said gently. "You stumbled under its weight. Any man would. But you're here now, Richard, that's what matters." He shook his head, bitterness in his voice. "You don't understand. I was terrified of them, of failing them. Every meltdown, every rejection, I saw it as proof I wasn't enough. And maybe I'm still not." Her tone grew firmer, though still kind. "Do you think being enough means never failing? Parenting isn't about perfection. It's about showing up even when you fall short. That's what Charlotte wanted for them. Not a flawless father, but a present one." The words struck him like a key turning in a locked door. For years he had measured himself against an impossible standard, believing love required flawless execution. But Mariah was right. Love was not about never failing. It was about returning again and again, even after failure. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire. Then, almost in a whisper, Richard asked, "And what about you? Why do you stay when everyone else ran?" Mariah hesitated, then spoke with a vulnerability he hadn't heard before. "Because I know what it feels like to be left behind. My father left when I was young. My mother worked herself to the bone to keep us afloat. And if I hadn't stepped in for my siblings, they would have felt alone too. I guess I stay because I can't bear the thought of any child carrying that emptiness." Richard studied her face, seeing not just resilience, but the scars of her past woven into her strength. In her, he recognized a reflection of his own fears and failures, but also a courage he lacked. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition deeper than words, a bond forged not by duty but by shared humanity. The following days carried subtle changes. Richard spoke more openly with the boys, not just instructing but engaging. He told Ethan stories from his own childhood, simple tales of climbing trees and scraped knees, and though Ethan rarely responded, he listened with wide eyes. He sat with Caleb through his meticulous routines, no longer impatient but curious, learning to see the world through his son's lens. And then came a moment that sealed the shift. One evening, as Richard tucked the boys into bed, Ethan whispered, "Night, Daddy." It was just 2 words, fragile and quiet, but Richard felt his chest break open with joy. He kissed his son's forehead, whispering back, "Good night, Ethan, I'm here." When he stepped into the hallway, Mariah was waiting. Their eyes met, and no words were needed. Both knew something had changed, not only in the boys, but in Richard himself. The Hayes mansion no longer felt like a fortress. Where once the halls echoed with tension and despair, they now carried the sounds of life. Ethan's humming, Caleb's quiet laughter, the occasional clatter of toys rolling across polished floors. The change was not dramatic or sudden, but steady, woven into the fabric of each day until the mansion itself seemed to exhale relief. Richard stood in the garden one afternoon, watching his sons chase each other clumsily along the path. Their steps were uneven, their voices scattered with stutters and pauses, but to him it was music, finer than any orchestra. He glanced toward Mariah, who sat nearby with a book in her lap, her gaze following the boys with quiet pride. A warmth spread through him, not of triumph but of gratitude, for her, for them, for the chance to start again. That evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Richard spoke softly, almost to himself. "I used to think this house was cursed, that no matter what I did, it would never feel like a home again." He paused, looking at Mariah and then at his sons, curled up on the rug. "But I was wrong. It wasn't cursed. It was waiting, for the right presence, the right patience, the right love." Ethan looked up, his small voice breaking through. "Home." Just one word, but it landed with the weight of years. Richard's eyes brimmed with tears, and he reached out, pulling both boys close. Caleb pressed against his side, his toy car still clutched tightly, while Ethan buried his face in his shoulder. Mariah watched silently, her heart swelling. She had not come here to heal a broken family, only to work, to survive in a city that demanded more than most could give. Yet somewhere along the way, she had become part of this story, not as an outsider, but as someone who belonged. Later that night, as the boys slept peacefully, Richard found her in the kitchen pouring tea. He leaned against the counter, his voice quiet but certain. "Mariah, you've given me more than I can ever repay. You gave my son stability, but you also gave me hope. You reminded me what it means to be a father." She looked at him, her expression soft. "I didn't give you anything you didn't already have. I just reminded you it was still there." His chest tightened with emotion, and for a moment he couldn't speak. Then he whispered, "Thank you for not leaving, for doing what no one else could." Mariah shook her head gently. "Not no one else. Just no one else tried long enough." The truth in her words humbled him. All his wealth, all his power, had never bought what she carried naturally. Endurance, compassion, love without condition. And in acknowledging it, Richard felt a sense of freedom he hadn't known since Charlotte was alive. As days turned into weeks, the Hayes mansion transformed. Guests who once remarked on its coldness now noticed warmth in its halls. The staff, once skeptical, found themselves drawn into the boys' progress, no longer whispering but admiring. Even Richard's relatives, though slow to admit it, recognized the undeniable difference. The man who once measured worth by numbers and appearances now measured it by smiles, words whispered at bedtime, and the steady trust of his sons. He had not become a perfect father, but he had become a present one, and that made all the difference. On a quiet evening, as he watched Ethan and Caleb play peacefully in the garden, Richard whispered to himself, "We're going to be all right." His eyes drifted to Mariah, who looked back at him with a knowing smile. Their journey had not been easy, but it had been real. And from that reality, something stronger than wealth or reputation had been built: a family. Before we close this story, if you believe in the power of patience, love, and resilience, make sure to subscribe to this channel. And don't stop here. Click on the next video that's waiting for you. Another story of transformation is just one step away.